This presentation is about the differences between research questions and hypotheses. My name is Kuba Glazek. I am one of the methodology experts here at the Chicago School, working out of the Los Angeles campus. And what I want to start with today is a bit of an overview of the research process, and then we'll start to see how this notion of research questions and hypotheses plays a role in that bigger picture. So the first thing that we always start with is an area of interest, right? An area that is somehow personally interesting or relevant or professionally important, whatever it may be. It's very pertinent to pick an area that you're not going to get bored with or exhausted by. Sometimes that's difficult, especially if you're a doctoral student. I say a couple of you are doctoral students, at least. And over the course of a couple of years, however long it takes to complete a dissertation, for example, you can find yourself kind of struggling with a topic, and it helps to have one that you actually find meaningful. So this is always the place you want to start. And from there, you want to start looking at literature and identifying gaps or contradictions in that literature and developing your research question. Now, this may seem like it should be more of a linear process, right? You do a lit review, you identify a gap or a contradiction, and that's where your research question comes from. That is a great place to start. But what I find in my experience working with students and actually working as a reviewer for a couple of journals is that researchers often kind of pull the plug on their lit review after very briefly scanning the literature and identifying a research question that may have already been answered. So the trick here, and we'll look at this in a little bit more detail, but not too much because that's not the focus, but the idea is that you identify the gaps or contradictions in the literature and you find out what is the next logical research question. But what if somebody's already looked at that question? What if you looked at some articles but read them without an eye for this particular gap? If you go back in, you might find, oh, there are clues that this research question has already been addressed. So that's why there are these sort of feedback arrows. And the key here is to more or less keep doing this until you're satisfied that there has actually been no empirical study that's been done on a research question that you've now definitely refined to the point where you know that it's something new, something that you can make a contribution to the field with. And from that point, that's where you develop a hypothesis and develop a study. So again, this is where we're going to focus most of the energy of this presentation. But there is kind of a cycle. You see this is kind of making a turn. It's going to keep going a little bit in a sort of circular fashion here. Once you have your hypothesis in place, the study itself tends to more or less emerge out of that hypothesis, because if you know what you have to study and how you're going to study it, then the study itself more or less falls into place. And I say more or less. That's a broad overgeneralization. But again, for the purposes of this presentation, that is more or less the case. Once you have your study designed, you collect your data, you analyze the data, and those are the next two steps. I think there may have been a question. If not, I'll continue. Okay. Once you analyze your data, that's when it comes time to actually write up the report, whether it's a dissertation, a research paper for a master's course or a master's thesis. Sometimes folks will write white papers in a professional setting, or a conference presentation, or a journal article, or a book chapter, whatever the case may be. That is always one of the final steps. And of course, the circle wouldn't be complete without one more arrow. And the idea here is that once you've written up one of these types of publications or research reports, whatever the case may be, that becomes part of the scientific literature lexicon, as it's called. So your literature is now out there, and other people can conduct their own literature reviews on the same area of interest, and the cycle continues. Or it could be you, right? You could continue to do research, and the analysis that you did identifies not only, you know, fodder for a new lit review. This error could go in different directions. It could go to identify a new gap or contradiction that came out of the woodwork as you analyze your data. There was some unexpected finding, and guess what? Now you've got a brand new research question that you can address with a new hypothesis, and the cycle continues. So, you know, it's not that it always leads to lit review, but that's just for convenience. Anyway, that's the overview. Again, like I mentioned, we're going to be focusing our energies here today, but I do want to point out one thing, which is that if you think of the world of the literature base, the scientific literature base that you can find yourself in within your chosen area, you always want to get to the center of that galaxy. You always want to know what exactly is going on, what's been studied, what hasn't been studied, and you kind of find yourself at the beginning at the periphery a little bit. But, you know, how do you know you're on the periphery and not, you know, in some other galaxy altogether? Well, for those of you who've never done this before, there are a couple of links I want to share with you. These are previous presentations that have talked about how to go about finding literature and how to go from that process to then turning that into a hypothesis development process. So I'm just pasting these links in the chat box here so you don't have to feverishly try to write down a bunch of random letters and numbers. Those are the links there. You should be able to access those through YouTube. The first one's a presentation that was done by one of the Chicago School librarians, looking at all sorts of different strategies and technical issues dealing with finding literature to get you to that goal. And the second one is a presentation I did a while back on similar kinds of topics and strategies with a little less technical significance, but more like conceptual issues. So, okay, what's interesting about this is that when you start a lit review, you start to learn things. And the more you learn, Albert Einstein famously said, the more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know. This may seem like a bit of a daunting proposition, right? For every question that you answer, two more take its place. But again, if you're studying something that you're very interested in, maybe something you even love, then you should be in pretty high spirits. This didn't bother him. If you choose an area that's meaningful to you, it shouldn't bother you as well. And as I mentioned, the results of a lit review lead to the beginnings of the next one. And so you can revise your search according to the clues that you get from the literature, right? You look for things like keywords that previous authors have used. You can search for those. You know, instruments that you may not be aware that they use to study certain constructs. Like if you're interested in something like depression, there may be instruments that are used to analyze aspects of depression that you may have not been familiar with before. You can search for those and see if those can help you understand whether your research question has been addressed before. And also authors who reappear time and time again. If you start to see names reappear, it's a pretty good guess that it's important to read their work. And so the idea is that we're really starting to zero in on a true research question, right? As you do these subsequent iterations of lit review, you start to really zero in on a final research question compared to one that you had originally. You might look back on and say, oh, wow, that was a really naive research question. I mean, you know, I've learned a lot through the lit review process. I've become more of an expert, and now this final research question is actually one that is unanswered. So this kind of iterative process is really key to get to a meaningful research question. So I can't stress that enough. And this is going to, of course, factor into the difference between what constitutes a research question versus a hypothesis, because a hypothesis really emerges from the research question, but first you have to have a research question to ask before you can develop a meaningful hypothesis to address it. So I promise this will all make sense soon, if it doesn't already. But here, I want to pause and see if there are any questions. If you want to, again, ask if you have your microphone live, or if you want to type in a question in the chat box, please feel free to do so. And I see that Dr. Adu, my colleague and fellow methodology expert, has just arrived. So if I happen to miss a question because I get caught up in the presentation, which I tend to do, and I start to talk really fast, he can jump in and remind me that there are questions being typed in. And he will also help me with adding links into the chat box. So he has a copy of the slides, and he will be pasting links and things like that in as we go. So, okay, any questions at this point? Okay. In that case, let's move forward. Once you have your lit review sort of completed, you may find that there are one of these three outcomes. One is that there's a lack of research on the topic. Another one is that there's converging evidence, all seeming to kind of point you in the same general direction, showing the same sort of repeating pattern of results. And the third one is that there's conflicting evidence. So different studies studying the same thing, or different authors studying the same thing, come up with contradictory findings. If you find a lack of research, that's a real opportunity for you to pave the way. Typically what happens is that you would develop a qualitative study and look at more open-ended types of research questions that don't necessarily have hypotheses attached to them, and we'll look at that in more detail. If you have converging evidence that you're starting to see, you want to avoid conducting a redundant study. The idea, again, is to refine the research question in light of what is already known to further the knowledge base, and I've already kind of covered that a little bit, but that's the kind of opportunity that you have if you start to see that, yes, there is a discernible center to that galaxy of literature, and then you can then move that galaxy into like a new world, so to speak. Move it forward and develop a study that will help everybody understand what the gaps are and what you're going to do about them. Or, of course, there is the possibility they have conflicting evidence, right? So it might not be that there's a gap that's identified, something that needs to be researched that hasn't been researched yet, but something that has been studied and people find different things. If that happens, there's an opportunity to investigate differences between studies, things like study design, the setting that the study was conducted in, the measures that were used, the population that was sampled. It really depends. Once you start to dig in, you start to see what the discrepancies might be between the methods that then may have led to different results. And if that happens, if you start to identify that variable, you can design a study around that and develop a research question and a hypothesis to go with it. How do you know you are complete with your lit review? What's a good sign? Well, a good sign is, there are a few different signs actually. One of the main ones is that you start to see that everybody's citing the same literature over and over again. You read yet another study that's citing ones that you've already read. You start to understand that, oh, this is just another example of the same thing that I've already looked at. If you go back to, there it is, this second link here, I talk a lot about how to know when you've hit the sort of end of the line, if you will, in terms of what's already known. So if you really want to know more about that, it's, that's a whole other presentation in and of itself. But definitely have a look at that, and that should help you understand when you've gotten to this point of, the end of the lit review, where, X marks the spot. Okay, great question, though. That is a very important question that a lot of people struggle with. I certainly struggled with it, and the best practices are definitely contained in that presentation that I just referenced. So I want to mention, first of all, now that we kind of have some idea of what a research question would entail, I want to talk about the difference between a thesis and a hypothesis or hypothesis. You'll notice that there's this notion of we pronounce it hypothesis, but from the Greek or the Latin, hypo meaning under, right? And that is a very important distinction because the thesis, which is the research question, is a sort of overarching question. And then the hypothesis fits underneath it. So that could be a good way to conceptualize it. And the thesis, basically, we're looking at a general inquiry about a construct of interest. So for example, depression among veterans, okay? That's a topic. It's a general kind of construct that is more or less ethereal. The question is, how do we actually measure depression? So what we need are operational definitions of depression, and if we're talking about, in this example, veterans, how do you define a veteran, right? We have to be very clear about what we mean when we say things like depression, veteran, whatever the topic may be. You need to have a very concrete, or what's called an operational definition of your construct. So before we get to that, one thing that's important to note is that when you have your research question in hand, it gets scientifically evaluated on the basis of observations. And what I mean by that is, once you have data, you then look at the data, and whatever those data tell you, you use those to zoom back out and evaluate your thesis, whether it's supported or not supported, or whether it has to be, reevaluated, whatever the case may be. The results will be what they will be. But if you've designed your study well, you should see something that you expected anyway. So this is where the hypothesis comes in. It's a prediction about the pattern of observable measurements that you expect to see. Or not see, but observe, literally, is the term that we use. So again, here we're using operational definitions. So for example, in the research question, you're talking about, depression, right? So if we're talking about depression, then in the hypothesis, you want to talk about the Beck Depression Inventory, for example. And this is, a validated measure of depression that's used throughout the scientific community to, get a measure of depression. So we're no longer talking about depression. We're talking about a specific operational definition of depression that we're going to use. And that clarifies things because now we can observe depression directly, so to speak. And the same would apply to, if we're talking about veterans, you would want to have an operational definition of a veteran. Maybe you want to include people who are in the National Guard, or maybe you don't, right? All these different things are going to have implications for how you design your study and also the findings that you get, right? Think back to the idea of contradictory results. What if a study looked at veterans who were in Vietnam versus veterans who were in Iraq versus veterans who were in the National Guard? Odds are that you're going to find different kinds of results in terms of depression, right? So as long as you have a good operational definition, you avoid confusion and you make your hypothesis much stronger than if you don't. Let's see. I see another question coming through. I'll get to it in one moment. So the hypothesis is analyzed using theme frequency, significance testing, confidence intervals, etc. This point talks about this idea of observations, right? If you're doing a qualitative study, you can extract themes from interviews that you conduct with your participants. You can always quantify that and look at how often somebody talks about a certain theme that emerges. You can do significance testing, which we'll look at in terms of quantitative studies. Confidence intervals are also a very useful tool used to describe the robustness of effects that are quantitative. It gives you the range of possibilities of an effect and so on. There's lots of different methods. We're not going to focus on it too much, but the idea is that you have these observations and you can then describe them in this fashion, which then, of course, gets evaluated in terms of the original research question, right? Okay, so now I see that there's this question. Do you have any current studies or focus groups with students completing dissertations, sort of like tracking students that use NCATE advice and guidance? I'm willing to participate in anything that would encompass being tracked while I begin my dissertation. It could support use of NCATE, just some thoughts. Thank you very much. I may very well follow up with you about that. And to answer your question, yes, we do have studies going on like that. So you may, in fact, in the future see some publications, some peer-reviewed publications coming out about NCATE effectiveness. Spoiler alert, we're doing a pretty good job. Okay, so since we're talking about hypothesis testing, might as well talk about the logic of it. Just a very quick sort of recap. I know that some of you may be familiar with this logic, some of you might not, so I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. The idea here, the sort of basic bottom line here is that you start with the assumption that there is no effect unless you can demonstrate otherwise. So, the assumption is no effect, meaning null, and this comes up all the time, the null hypothesis. You may be familiar with this, but your aim is to reject the null hypothesis. Any study where you're trying to demonstrate an effect, you're trying to reject this notion that there is no effect. That's what we call rejecting the null hypothesis. Second, under this assumption, what is the probability of the observed effect? This means like, okay, once you collect your data, you analyze it, and you see, oh, there's a big difference between group A and group B on, the Beck depression inventory. Okay, so if there's no effect, what's the probability that you saw this big of a difference? And if that difference is small, if that probability is small, then we conclude that the assumption of no effect is untenable, and we reject it. So we reject the null hypothesis if that probability of no effect is really small, given the fact that you've observed a pretty large effect. Now, this is not a stats lecture. I'm not going to go into how we know that the probability is less than 5%. The idea generally is that you have this framing of a null hypothesis, and then you have the logic by which you can reject it. I want to pause here and see if that makes sense to everybody. If not, just shoot, because if you're wondering what the heck I just said, odds are other people are as well. I don't know, maybe I did a good job explaining it. Okay, if you're still typing, go ahead and finish up. I'm going to move on, and if there's a question, then I'll circle back around. But okay, so now that we know a little bit about hypothesis testing and research questions, let's look at how you go from one to the other. Again, remember, we got those three kinds of main scenarios, right? The first one being when there's little scientific knowledge about a topic. This is where you actually don't have a hypothesis per se. This is where you would develop a more open-ended, exploratory research question, which again, I think I alluded to this, it typically leads to a qualitative study design where you're kind of asking people what their experience is, and you have the opportunity to ask follow-up questions, and you develop themes and start to build a theory of what it means to have a certain kind of life experience. So, for example, what is the lived experience of residents with places, residents of places with little sunshine? This is a very open-ended question, right? An open-ended research question. We're not, saying that their experience is this or that. We're not hypothesizing that it's anything. We're leaving it open, right? So that's the gist of that. If there is a pattern of converging evidence, right, this is that second scenario where you have a lot of literature saying, look, this seems to be a trend, so let's try to make some more sense of it as researchers. So let's just assume that you did a lit review and it shows that A, depression and suicide are related, and B, lack of sunshine and depression are related. So you've got this common link between depression and suicide and depression and lack of sunshine. So therefore, logically, lack of sunshine and suicide should also be related, right? But that is an assumption. We don't want to assume anything because you know what that does. But what we do want to do is test this hypothesis. So again, with a hypothesis, we would say something along the lines of Beck depression inventory scores were hypothesized to be significantly positively correlated with suicide probability scale scores. And this is a testable hypothesis using operationalized definitions of our constructs, right? The Beck depression inventory, I talked about that. It's a validated scale. And also this suicide probability scale, this is also a validated measure that, you can look up, and if you search through the, for example, PsycInfo or some other psychological database, you'll find it being used all the time. Well, thankfully not all the time, right? But in research on suicide. So this is the kind of process that you can go through, right? Notice we're going all the way back to lit review, going through the research question of interest, all the way through to a testable hypothesis that will then have implications for the research question and the area of research in general. That's this scenario sort of summed up. And finally, what if there's conflicting evidence, right? We looked at this scenario as well. Here, you would posit a hypothesis about a potential source of those discrepant results, and then use logic and also probably more lit review to determine possible causes of that discrepancy. Or again, if there are multiple discrepancies, there could be a common cause of all of them. You never know. It depends what you kind of see. So let's do another example. Let's assume that the literature shows some studies, that studies conducted during winter, all studies conducted during winter show A, low suicide risk in Scandinavia, and B, high suicide risk in the Pacific Northwest, you know, like Oregon, Washington State here in the United States, and Scandinavia being, you know, like Norway, Sweden, Iceland, all these places that are up in the northern latitudes. They both have low sunlight, right? So we kind of already know a little bit about both of them. They have low sunlight, so the whole theory here, looking at the research question of lack of sunlight being related to depression, or rather suicide, I guess. And there's got to be something different though, right? Like, why does one show low suicide risk and the other shows high suicide risk? Well, let's look into it. What's different about the different studies? Well, one possible thing is that it's total annual rainfall, meaning that we're using that as a proxy of cloud cover, right? Pacific Northwest, very cloudy, very overcast a lot of the year. Scandinavia, the reason for low sunlight is not because of overcast, but because of the fact that the sun is, you know, below the horizon for a good part of the winter. So if you look at that as a potential explanation, then you can directly study it, and you make this hypothesis that total annual rainfall significantly predicts suicide probability scale scores. So if in Scandinavia they have not a lot of rainfall, but and therefore not a lot of cloud cover, but in the Pacific Northwest they do have a lot of cloud cover, therefore a lot of annual rainfall, and you see this link, then you might be onto something, right? So hopefully this logic makes sense. And again, this all really kind of depends on this process that I illustrated on the very first slide, right? That you start to see patterns that maybe conflicting with each other, and you come up with this maybe epiphany even, or some kind of insight that allows you to understand what that explanation might be. So obviously, if I were doing this and I had this idea, maybe it's about rainfall and not about sunlight per se. Well, guess what? I would go back in, look at literature on rainfall or cloud cover and suicide risk, and then determine whether or not that is a previously explored research question, right? If it is, I would, you know, go back to the drawing board. But if not, then I know I've hit pay dirt. And then I would develop a hypothesis like this. But you see, it's more nuanced, right? It's more nuanced than something more generic, and it's based on you know, reviewing literature and doing all that kind of fun stuff. Okay, so from here, we need to look a little bit about directionality of hypotheses. There's two different kinds. One is that you have an open-ended hypothesis. Another one is directional. So I'll talk about each in turn. Oh, that's weird. Okay, sorry, this H0, the 0 should be a subscript and the 1 should be a subscript. So it should actually look a little bit like, sorry, bear with me for 1 minute. These should really look like that. So that you have these little subscripts here. I don't know what happened there. Anyway, so remember, the null hypothesis is that there's no effect, right? But your alternative hypothesis, these are also, the subscript is sometimes 1, sometimes it's a capital A for alternative. Anyway, that's not all that important. You could say that there's a significant difference between group A and group B on some variable. Another alternative is that you have, variable A is significantly correlated with variable B, but notice you're not saying the direction of the effect. So this is directly addressed with a directional hypothesis. So again, the null hypothesis, same thing, all right, sorry about that. There's a null effect is the null hypothesis, but then the alternative hypothesis is that group A is significantly higher than group B on some measure, or variable A is significantly negatively correlated with variable B. And here the direction of the effect is stated, right? So you're saying not only are they different, but you're predicting which group is significantly higher on that measure than what other group. And that is often the appropriate level of analysis, but other times it's not. It really depends on what's available to you. It's based on the ability to predict those results. And it goes back to the literature review and those identified gaps or contradictions. So if we go back to the example of the Pacific Northwest versus Scandinavia, you'll notice that what I did there, is I said that total annual rainfall significantly predicts suicide probability scales, right? Well, if I read a study that showed that there was high suicide risk in the Pacific Northwest, but relatively low suicide risk in Scandinavia, and I know that there's more rain and more cloud cover in the Pacific Northwest, then I could make this hypothesis even stronger and predict that total annual rainfall significantly predicts increased suicide probability scale scores, right? Maybe you didn't notice this last time, but now making it more precise, more specific on the basis of the facts that I have at my disposal. So it really depends on, how much previous knowledge there is out there that will dictate the degree to which you can make a directional, aka one-tailed hypothesis versus sticking to a more open-ended one. Okay, so let me pause there. Let's see if there's any questions. All right, again, if anything comes up, do let me know. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about avoiding errors in hypothesis formulation, because this is stuff that I've seen working with students in different contexts, and again looking at my work as a journal editor, reviewer, a peer reviewer. There is a lot of this that goes on, so you want to make sure to get off on the right foot and avoid this kind of problem. And then I'm going to talk about more sort of substantial issues. These are more easy to tackle, and then the next slides will look at more complex issues. But so basically, one issue that comes up is positing open-ended hypotheses as two separate directional hypotheses. At the end, to address this question that just came up, yes, you can come talk to us. You'll have our contact info at the end of the presentation, so you can definitely get some assistance. So the null hypothesis is okay. There's no difference between groups A and B on measure X. Fine, but you could then see somebody say, all right, group A is significantly higher than group B on measure X. And then the next hypothesis is, oh, group A is significantly lower than group A is significantly lower than group B. This should say group B right here, not group A on measure X. And so it's kind of like hedging your bets, right? Saying, well, it could be this, it could be that. But the way to do that is to just posit an open-ended hypothesis and say that they're going to be significantly different without specifying two separate hypotheses with two separate directions. Then there's a kind of complementary problem of positing redundant hypotheses. Again, the null hypothesis, no difference between groups A and B on measure X, fine. But then someone might say group A is significantly higher than group B on measure X, and then say that group B is significantly lower than group A on measure X. Well, that's saying the same exact thing, right? If group A is higher than B is obviously going to be lower than A. So you would only choose one of those and write that up instead of stating both. So again, these are relatively straightforward issues. The next issue is a little bit more involved. Let's say that you do your lit review, you determine that there's not a lot of literature or none at all on your chosen topic, but you decide on a confirmatory study. A confirmatory study being where you make a prediction about the relationship of a couple of variables or more than two, doesn't matter, and say, okay, I have a very good theoretical basis for saying that this is going to be the pattern. So that's the opposite, more or less, of an exploratory study, where you're kind of asking things in a more open-ended manner, right? So the research question might be, what is the lived experience of veterans living on Skid Row? Skid Row being, if anyone doesn't know, it's like a homeless community. There's one in Los Angeles. A lot of major cities have them. And these communities of people just emerge on the street, basically. So if your hypothesis is then, okay, the quality of life scale X, whatever it might be, is negatively correlated with number of months living on Skid Row. Okay, well, you'll see that I got this really fancy, stock image of a guy with blinders on, right? And that is figuratively, not literally, what could happen is that phrasing such a specific hypothesis on the basis of not a lot of background really puts blinders on your perspective. So first of all, you wouldn't know that this quality of life is negatively correlated with the duration of living on Skid Row. You're assuming that, the longer someone is living on Skid Row, the worse their quality of life is. But, maybe the relationship is opposite. Maybe there's something that is related to living on Skid Row where you maybe build a community, you make friends, or you realize there are resources available for you by talking to people, or people who serve the homeless community come by and provide you with resources, and then your quality of life increases, right? So first of all, that's, this negative relationship might actually be positive. You wouldn't know that if there's nothing for you to go on except intuition, which is fine, but it's not scientific. And even if you did posit an open-ended hypothesis, you would miss potentially relevant variables. So what I mean by that is, if quality of life scale X only looks at one aspect of quality of life that has nothing to do with the lived experience of veterans living on Skid Row, then you're going to see maybe no correlation between quality of life and time spent on Skid Row, because they're filling this thing out. They're saying, I don't even know how to answer these questions. Sure, I agree to this. I disagree with that. I'm neutral on this one. But the problem is that they're not really able. You're not able to tap into their experience. You're throwing instruments at them that are designed to confirm the presence of certain types of phenomena or constructs, not to explore the experience in an open-ended manner. So I've seen this happen from time to time, and it's definitely something to avoid. So just, be careful to avoid this kind of issue. And, it's important to note that it works in the opposite direction as well. So sometimes you see a dissertation or a journal article that talks about a lot of the background knowledge, reviews a lot of literature, but then backtracks and conducts more or less a redundant study. Now, sometimes you want to do a redundant study. These are called, confirmations. Like if one study finds a certain effect, you want to replicate. I think I said confirmations. I mean replications. If you do a replication study, that's often a good thing to do, but not in the case of something like a doctoral dissertation, certainly. The kind of process that somebody might go through, for example, is at time one, they start a research question. Then they do a lit review. They complete and I use that term loosely, they complete the lit review, and then later they put together a hypothesis based on that research question from time one, despite all of that novel information from time two. I've seen this happen a number of times, where the lit review is basically just like an annotated bibliography of study after study after study that's, people who have examined these different phenomena that are related to the research question. But then after that's all done, there's no synthesis. There's no tying everything together into a next logical research question, the next logical step in that area, but rather just kind of goes back and reverts to, that original research question, ignoring everything that came in between. So instead of doing this, right, we looked at this idea of going through this iterative process and then developing a hypothesis and designing a study. It's rather area of interest, research question, hypothesis, which is a good start, but it's not up to par for any kind of research that you'd be doing at the graduate level. So make sure to avoid this area as well, definitely. Okay, now I keep talking about things not to do, right? Let's look at best practices. Let's look at an example of how to actually go through this process in a scientifically rigorous way. So, an original research question: what is the experience of acculturation of immigrant group X? And acculturation, if you're not familiar with this term, it's basically how someone adapts to a host society after emigrating from their native land and coming to the host country or culture. So that's what acculturation is. And if we're talking about immigrant group X, that means like a specific immigrant group, whether it's an ethnicity or a nationality or a race or anything like that. Whatever ethnic or immigrant group rather you're interested in studying, that's what that stands for there. Is there a question? Okay. So let's say that the literature review indicates that there are important variables across immigrant groups. So, you read the literature on Japanese immigrants, Australian immigrants, Brazilian immigrants, and European immigrants, and let's just say to the United States. All right, let's just keep a constraint to immigrants to the U.S. And you find that across all of those different populations, these four variables still pertain, right? That you have acculturative stress, you have the degree of acculturation that someone attains, you have life satisfaction, and you have subjective well-being. And all four of these are found to be very closely related to the experience of acculturation of all these different immigrant groups. Well, that tells you something, right? This is an example of when all the evidence kind of converges on a particular picture, right? So the revised research question, you wouldn't go back to this idea of what is the experience of acculturation because you kind of already know, right? If all of these different immigrant groups have these four variables in common, why would another immigrant group not have them in common? So the revised research question might be, among acculturative stress, life satisfaction, and subjective well-being, which most strongly predicts acculturation among immigrant group X? Because now you're pushing it forward a little bit, right? You're saying, okay, I don't want it to be so open-ended. I want it to be more pertinent and more focused on the variables that I know are important, and then I want to know for this group, what are the sort of nuanced variations for these people? And so from there, your hypotheses might be that acculturation rating scale. So okay, acculturation rating. This is again a validated measure. That I'm not making this one up. This is a validated measure of acculturation, and that can be significantly negatively correlated with social, attitudinal, familial, and environmental scale scores. This is again a validated measure of the degree of acculturative stress, and the next hypothesis might be that acculturation rating scale score is significantly positively correlated, not negative. Remember, the first one was negative. Here you can say positively correlated with satisfaction with life scale and flourishing scale scores. Those represent life satisfaction and subjective well-being. And then finally, you might have a hypothesis that says after controlling for all their predictors, the SAFE score, right, this one, is the strongest predictor of acculturation rating scale score. Now, once you have, and this, by the way, would be an example of a multiple regression. Again, this is not like a stats lecture, so I don't want to go into too much depth on this, but basically, you can start to look at the specific relationships between these variables and acculturation in a particular immigrant group. And, the sort of big picture here is that let's say that you want to develop a private practice and you want to be the expert on immigrant group X, right? You want to serve that particular population because they are very highly represented in your area. So for example, in Chicago, it might be Polish immigrants. In Los Angeles, it might be Iranian or Armenian immigrants. In Washington, D.C., it might be Ethiopian immigrants, right? Whatever the case may be. There are these kinds of tests that you could run and then start to understand that population better by virtue of your literature review and by virtue of running an empirical study that then helps you and other therapists and other researchers understand what their acculturation experience is. And then you can help them address the issues that you can predict as being important to them. That's why you would have, these ideas of what kinds of variables affect their acculturation, right? Or not affect, but are associated with. I don't want to go into like causal language. So now, once you have this in place, then the study almost writes itself, right? Because you have to collect data on all these different scales, and the methods of doing that are, of course, a whole separate presentation. So I don't want to downplay that, but basically, once you have your hypothesis in place, the design is relatively less time-consuming at the very least. So let's not downplay the design issues, because there's always things like counterbalancing the order of presenting the scales. There's always the sampling technique that you use. That's going to be very important in terms of the kind of data that you actually get and the generalizability of the findings, all sorts of different issues. So again, one of you asked, about having issues with developing research questions and things like this. Come talk to us. We can definitely help with this kind of stuff here at NCADE, and specifically myself and Dr. Adu from the methodology standpoint. Shameless self-promotion, I know, but that's what we're here for. Okay, so let's recap everything. The process is, it's a heuristic process that I'm going to recap here. So it's not specific or precise to any kind of study, but it's just a set of guidelines. Your area of interest leads to a research question, right? A research question leads to a literature review. A literature review leads to reiteration of the research question. The final research question, after you've reiterated it and fine-tuned it and everything, leads to a hypothesis and a study design. The results of the study are then interpreted in support or refutation of your hypothesis. And then the implications are discussed in terms of the research question and the area of interest in general. So to diagram it, you may have seen this before, where you go from something very general and you narrow it down into something more specific, right? So we start out with that area of interest, look into specific pertinent research questions that may be completely different from what you originally thought was interesting. Once you start to understand the area, then you start to understand what needs to be done. And then you develop that hypothesis, right? And then from there, in between these two pyramids, this is where data collection takes place, right? And then in your analysis, you confirm or disconfirm the hypothesis, and then you zoom all the way back out to the implications for the research question and the area of interest in general. And then, of course, you have to write it all up, right? But hopefully you're doing that as you go. The one thing that I do want to mention about the write-up is that it is a separate process from all this, right? It's very closely related, and you may have seen the same kind of diagram done for like your standard kind of, argument in an essay form, but here the process is analogous in writing as it is in developing a research approach. So I don't want you to sort of equivocate the two. You don't want to say that they're the same thing. There are analogies here to be made, but it is very much a separate process of logical scientific thinking that is mirrored in the way that you then write it up, right? So keep that in mind. And we also have dissertation writing experts at NCADE who can help you with the sort of writing piece. But here we're, again, focused on the methodology. Speaking of which, there are ways to contact us. So again, like I mentioned, this video is being recorded. I'm going